The snowstorm came without warning, a wall of white devouring everything in its path. Within minutes, the landscape of the Eastern Front disappeared beneath a swirling blizzard, erasing the horizon and turning friend and foe alike into shadows. It was February 1944, and the German army was falling back, scattered and broken under the relentless Soviet advance. Tanks were out of fuel, communication lines cut, and morale nearly gone. Entire divisions were retreating through forests and open fields, chased by an enemy that seemed endless. Amid that chaos, one man, a mid-level German commander with a few dozen exhausted soldiers, received the impossible order. Hold the line for 48 hours. Long enough, they said, for the main force to retreat and regroup. Long enough to die, he thought. The position was nothing more than a small village, frozen and half destroyed, surrounded by fields that stretched into emptiness. The commander knew the Soviets would come through it. It was the only road passable by vehicles for miles. If the village fell too soon, the entire German withdrawal route would collapse. There were no reinforcements coming, no artillery support, and barely any ammunition left. His men were cold, hungry, and hollow-eyed. They had seen too much, lost too much. Some had already accepted death. Others were too numb to care. But when he looked at them, he saw what the war had turned them into. Men who had stopped fighting for orders and started fighting for time. The commander spent the last hours of daylight walking through the ruins, studying every building, every alley, every possible choke point. There was no strategy left to invent, only desperation shaped into logic. He decided not to defend the village as a whole. That would be suicide. Instead, he would make the enemy believe it was heavily fortified. He ordered his men to spread out, lighting fires in empty houses, planting helmets on sticks, and setting rifles where they could be seen through windows. He had them scatter broken radios to give the impression of communication posts. At night, they fired in rotation, single shots spaced out across the ruins, mimicking the rhythm of a full garrison. To any observer, it would look like at least a company was entrenched there. In truth, they were 38 men, and one man's refusal to surrender to logic. By dawn, the storm had thinned to a pale fog, and the world looked like a ghost. The Soviets came as expected. Armored cars first, then infantry. The commander watched from the second floor of a half-collapsed barn as they halted at the edge of the field, scanning the village through binoculars. His ruse had worked. They hesitated. When the first shells came, they landed far, cautious, testing for artillery response. There was none, but he had anticipated that. He signaled his men, and they detonated two makeshift charges in the distance, small explosions that mimicked return fire. It was a lie built on another lie, and it held. The Soviets didn't rush. They circled, probed, sent scouts forward who vanished into the fog and didn't return. The commander knew why. The frozen streets had been mined the night before with every explosive they could salvage, from grenades to buried anti-tank shells. Some of the mines were dummies, nothing more than empty canisters meant to slow the enemy down through fear alone. The real ones were hidden too well to distinguish. The field around the village became a trap of hesitation. Time passed. Hours stretched into a day. The Soviets shelled the area relentlessly, turning snow into mud and ruins into dust. But they never advanced. The illusion of strength held them back. By the second night, the temperature dropped further, and the storm returned. His men were nearly delirious with exhaustion. Ammunition was down to a handful of rounds each. Still, the commander kept them moving, shifting positions, lighting fires in new places, whispering orders through the dark. When one of his men fell asleep standing, he left him there. When another collapsed, he covered him with snow to make it look like a body. He had stopped thinking of survival in human terms. He was playing chess with death, and the pieces were already breaking. The Soviets tried again at dawn. This time they came harder, pushing with tanks and infantry in unison. The commander had saved his last surprise for that moment. He had positioned the few remaining anti-tank weapons not to destroy the enemy, but to cripple them. Shoot the first vehicle, block the road, and force the column to funnel into a single kill zone. When the first tank exploded, the road became chaos. Smoke blinded the gunners, confusion rippled through the ranks, and once again they fell back to reorganize. The second day ended the same as the first, with the line unbroken, though held by ghosts. Of the original 38 men, only 14 were still alive. The rest were silent markers scattered through the snow. The commander stood among them as the light faded, his uniform stiff with frost, his mind hollowed by fatigue. He had done it. 48 hours of holding the impossible. No one had expected him to succeed. No one would ever truly understand how he did. When relief finally arrived on the third morning, the rescuing battalion found the village in ruins, and the survivors barely conscious. They found the commander sitting by a window, staring out at the empty fields as if waiting for something still unseen. When they told him he had done his duty, he didn't answer. He simply nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon that had nearly swallowed him. They said later that his plan had been suicidal, and it was. But suicide in war sometimes looked a lot like strategy, and for 48 hours in the dead of winter, one man's madness had become the only thing holding the line between retreat and annihilation. The storm eased but left the world colorless, stripped of sound and shape. Smoke from the burned-out buildings curled into the white sky like ghostly threads, and the air stank of frozen ash and oil. The commander stood in the middle of the village square, staring at what was left of his position. The houses were half collapsed, their roofs caved in from shell fire, windows blown out, and doorways sealed with snowdrifts. His men moved slowly through the ruins, hunched figures wrapped in tattered greatcoats, faces hollow and pale from cold and sleeplessness. They no longer spoke unless necessary. Even their breathing seemed cautious, as if afraid to draw the enemy's attention. He counted them again. 14 still breathing, though 2 were badly wounded. The rest were scattered across the wreckage, marked by rifles stuck upright in the snow, a gesture he'd ordered the night before to make it seem like they were still manning the line. To the Soviets watching from the far tree line, the village might still look alive, but inside it was a graveyard with a heartbeat too weak to last. He had held the line for 48 hours, as ordered. Yet instead of relief, there was a strange emptiness inside him. Victory had become an abstract thing, stripped of meaning. He had not won anything. He had only delayed loss. Still, delay was all that command had asked for. Somewhere miles behind him, an entire division was now moving out of the pocket they'd been trapped in. They would live because this place had not fallen. That was enough. As he walked between the ruins, he could hear the distant hum of engines. Faint, careful, growing louder. German engines, not Soviet. Reinforcements at last. The sound was unreal, almost foreign after so much silence. His men stirred, lifting their heads like dogs hearing a voice they no longer believed existed. The first armored vehicles appeared through the haze, gray shapes gliding across the snow. The commander watched them approach with no relief, only a deep, reluctant understanding. The moment you survive your own death, the world becomes something else entirely. The reinforcements stopped short of the village, wary of mines and traps. A group of soldiers dismounted and advanced on foot, their weapons raised, expressions hard and professional. They found the commander standing by what had once been the town hall, his uniform torn, face streaked with soot and frost. They saluted, asked for a report, but he gave only the essentials: casualties, ammunition, enemy strength. When they pressed for details, he said nothing about the deception, the fake fires, the shifting shadows that had made his handful of men look like an army. He didn't explain that victory had been a performance, that survival had depended on illusion and madness. Some truths didn't belong in reports. The newcomers began clearing the area, dismantling the barricades and dragging the dead into piles. The commander watched in silence, every movement of theirs too neat, too efficient. These were men still unscarred by hopelessness. He envied them. They would never understand that this ridge of rubble had been held not by strategy, but by desperation so pure it became art. He wondered if any of them could feel the weight of what had happened here, the invisible line that had divided reason from instinct, sanity from survival. When night fell, the new officers ordered the men to rest. Fires flickered inside the ruins again, this time real ones, made for warmth, not deception. The commander sat apart from the others, staring into the flames. His coat still smelled of smoke and gunpowder. The embers reminded him of the 2 nights before. of how he had made his men light decoy fires, pretending to cook food, pretending they were more than shadows in the cold. He thought of the men who hadn't survived to see the flames tonight, their faces half frozen in the expressions they'd worn at death. Surprise, confusion, sometimes peace. He wondered if he'd remember them as men or as pieces of a plan. Outside the circle of firelight, the snow began to fall again. The wind moaned through the broken chimneys, carrying with it faint echoes. Shouts, gunfire, voices that weren't really there. The commander tilted his head as if listening, though he knew there was nothing to hear. Still, part of him imagined that the ridge was whispering back, as if it remembered. The land had seen too much to ever forget. Somewhere far away, the war was still raging, lines moving forward and backward like breath. Orders would come again soon, to advance, to retreat, to hold another impossible position. He would obey them, as he always had. But something inside him had shifted. He understood now that command wasn't about strategy or courage. It was about the moment you decided to stop waiting for rescue and become the thing that stood between the living and the void. As dawn approached, the wind quieted. The commander rose, tightening his coat. He looked once more across the ruined village, a place that had been both his prison and his fortress. The fires had burned low, their smoke rising straight into the pale morning sky. He knew they would move on soon, leave this place behind, erase it from the maps. But even after the snow buried it again, the ridge would keep its story. And somewhere beneath the frost and the ashes, his own madness would still be waiting. The echo of a suicidal plan that had somehow held the line long enough for the world to turn again. The orders to move out came at first light. The wind had died, and the sky above the ruined village was a pale gray, the kind that offered no warmth and no mercy. The commander stood alone for a moment in the square, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been both his fortress and his tomb. The snow had frozen over the craters and the tracks, sealing the dead beneath a clean white sheet. His surviving men were packing what little they had left: rusted rifles, torn packs, blood-stained blankets. None of them spoke. Their silence was not discipline. It was exhaustion so deep it had erased even fear. When the convoy arrived, a colonel climbed down from one of the half-tracks, his uniform immaculate, his face untouched by frostbite or smoke. He looked around the village, his expression unreadable, and then turned to the commander. The words he spoke were brief, formal, efficient. They were to withdraw immediately and join the regrouping forces west of the river. The ridge would be destroyed, mined and burned to deny it to the enemy. It was, he said, a routine measure. The commander nodded, but the word routine stayed in his mind, echoing with quiet disbelief. There had been nothing routine about what had happened here. He watched as engineers planted charges through the ruins, wrapping the broken beams and stone foundations with explosives. The men worked quickly, their boots crunching in the frost, their breath clouds in the cold air. The commander felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching someone dismantle a grave. Every explosion that would come would erase a piece of what had happened. Every wall, every frozen body, every trick that had kept them alive. The battlefield was being rewritten before his eyes, turned from a story of survival into another line on a military map. When the charges were set, he gathered his men one last time. 14 reduced to 9, 2 barely standing, their faces wrapped in bandages that had frozen stiff. They stood at attention out of habit, not strength. The commander said nothing for a long time. There were no speeches left in him. What could he say that wouldn't sound like a lie? That their suffering had meaning? That holding this line had changed anything? No. Words would only cheapen what they had done. So he simply nodded to them, and they nodded back. In that small, wordless exchange, there was more understanding than any order could ever hold. When they left, he was the last to go. He walked through the village one final time, past the places where his men had fought and fallen, past the shattered barn from which he had watched the first Soviet approach. The smell of gunpowder still clung to the walls. He paused beside the church, or what was left of it, just a corner of the stone bell tower still standing, leaning at an angle against the wind. Near its base, a patch of frozen ground caught his eye. Someone had planted a small wooden cross there in the night. It wasn't his doing, and he didn't know who had carved it, but he recognized the gesture. Beneath that frozen dirt was one of his men, perhaps the first to die, perhaps the last. It didn't matter. He took off his glove, brushed the snow from the cross, and stood there a moment, head bowed. Then he turned away. The explosions began minutes later, low thuds rolling through the valley like distant thunder. The ridge was gone, swallowed by fire and smoke once again, as if the earth itself had decided to hide the evidence of its defiance. The commander didn't look back. Some places belonged to memory alone. The retreat was slow. The roads were choked with ice and abandoned vehicles. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same expression on the faces of the men trudging beside him. A kind of dull endurance. The emptiness of those who had survived what they weren't supposed to. Along the route, they passed refugees, broken machines, horses frozen where they had fallen. The Eastern Front had become a landscape of exhaustion. When they reached the regrouping point days later, command praised him. His report was read aloud, short, factual, emotionless. Position held for 48 hours under sustained attack. Enemy advance delayed, strategic withdrawal successful. There were murmurs of respect, even a medal recommendation. But the commander felt nothing. The words were too small for what they had cost. That night, as others slept, he walked away from camp and stood at the edge of a frozen river. The moonlight reflected faintly on the ice, turning the surface silver. He stared across the emptiness and thought of the ridge, of the bodies, the wind, the silence after each explosion. The world called what he had done suicidal, but he knew better. It wasn't suicide. It was something beyond it. The refusal to accept that meaning dies when hope does. The next assignment came sooner than anyone expected. Barely a week after leaving the ridge, the commander and what remained of his unit were sent back to the front. A new sector, another crumbling position on the edge of collapse. Orders were the same: hold at all costs, delay the Soviets long enough for the main force to reorganize. It was a familiar script, one he could now recite in his sleep. The war had become a repetition of impossible stands and temporary victories, each one erasing the last. The new line was nothing more than a stretch of broken forest on the outskirts of a frozen river plain. The trees were shattered by artillery, their trunks splintered and blackened. The air smelled of smoke and wet bark. The commander surveyed the terrain with the same detached precision he had used at the ridge. He no longer saw landscapes, only cover, choke points, and lines of fire. The men under his command, a mixture of veterans and fresh recruits, followed him through the snow in silence. The younger ones still looked for signs of hope in their superior's face. The older ones knew better. Hope wasn't strategy. By evening, they had dug shallow trenches and fortified them with logs and frozen earth. The cold was worse here. It ate through gloves and coats, creeping into bone. The men's movements grew sluggish, their hands trembling when they tried to load their rifles. They spoke little, conserving breath and warmth alike. The commander moved among them, checking positions, adjusting fields of fire, counting ammunition. There was less than he'd expected, barely enough for a single engagement. He didn't show his frustration. Fear spread faster than frost. Night fell quickly. The sky above was low and heavy, glowing faintly from distant fires on the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Soviet advance was grinding forward again. The sound of engines and artillery a constant background hum. The commander stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the faint orange flashes in the distance. The land between him and the enemy was open, flat, unforgiving. He knew they would come at dawn. They always did. He tried to sleep in a dugout, but rest never came. When he closed his eyes, he saw the ridge, the faces of his men, the burning houses, the flicker of fires that weren't real. Every sound pulled him back: a snapping branch, a shifting breeze, the rustle of boots in the snow. The line between past and present blurred until both felt the same. He realized with a kind of weary clarity that he was no longer fighting the enemy in front of him, but the memory of the one behind. Just before dawn, the first shells landed. They came without warning, slamming into the frozen ground with a force that shook the earth. Snow erupted into clouds of steam and soil. The men scrambled into positions, their breath white and fast. The commander shouted orders, brief, controlled, automatic. The artillery barrage lasted less than 10 minutes but left the forest in ruins. Then came the silence, that terrible pause before the infantry pushed forward. Through the smoke, he saw movement, dark shapes spreading out across the plain. The Soviets were advancing in staggered lines, disciplined and relentless. The commander gave the order to hold fire until they were close. His men waited, trembling behind the logs, the metallic scent of gun oil mixing with sweat and fear. When the enemy came within 200 meters, he raised his hand. A single flare arced into the sky, bursting in pale light, and the forest came alive. Gunfire cracked through the trees. The Germans fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, every shot deliberate. Soviet soldiers dropped into the snow, but more kept coming, their outlines blurred by smoke. The commander moved from position to position, checking for gaps, shouting for the men to shift their fire. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded like a drum. He could feel the line bending under pressure. The younger soldiers began to panic, their firing wild and uneven. He steadied them not with words but by standing exposed, firing calmly from the open trench. His presence forced them back into discipline. Hours passed and the battlefield became a storm of noise. Gunfire, explosions, screams blending into one endless sound. The Soviets attacked in waves, each one repelled by sheer stubbornness. By midday, the Germans were nearly out of ammunition. The commander ordered his men to fall back to the secondary line, a narrow ridge behind the tree line. They moved in small groups, covering each other through bursts of machine gun fire. The retreat was slow, methodical, controlled chaos. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the battlefield silent and still. The trees were black silhouettes against a dull white sky, their branches heavy with frost and smoke. The air was sharp enough to cut. The commander stood at the edge of the trench, watching the horizon through a haze of gunpowder and fog. His uniform was stiff with frozen mud, his hands raw and cracked. Around him, the few men who remained alive were little more than shadows, gaunt, hollow-eyed figures wrapped in torn coats and rags. None of them spoke. They had survived the night, but survival had begun to feel meaningless, an instinct without purpose. The Soviets had withdrawn before dawn, leaving their dead scattered across the open plain. It wasn't victory, only exhaustion on both sides. The commander knew they would return once their artillery was repositioned and their columns reorganized. He had seen this rhythm too many times. Attack, pause, rebuild, strike again. The war was a cycle with no resolution, just repetition until one side ran out of men to send forward. He moved slowly along the trench, checking positions that no longer mattered. The rifles were frozen in place, their barrels crusted with ice. Ammunition boxes were nearly empty. The wounded lay in the dugouts, half conscious, wrapped in blankets that had turned to boards of frost. A medic, the last one left, was tending to a soldier whose legs were gone, murmuring words that were more for himself than the dying man. The commander paused beside them, but there was nothing to say. There was nothing left to promise. Beyond the tree line, the horizon flickered with light. The Soviets were burning the villages they'd taken the night before. Smoke rose in thick columns that twisted into the pale sky. The commander watched the flames for a long time. There had been a time, months ago, when fire had meant warmth, civilization, life. Now it only meant advance. Another reminder that everything behind him was shrinking. At noon, new orders arrived by courier. Hold for 12 more hours. Relief was on the way, though the commander no longer believed in such things. The courier, a young lieutenant with clean boots and clear eyes, read the message aloud, his voice trembling slightly. The commander took the paper from him, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat without a word. The lieutenant stood awkwardly, unsure whether to salute or run. In the end, he turned back toward the forest and disappeared into the fog. The commander returned to the trench. His men looked up at him as he passed, searching for something in his expression. Direction, reassurance, maybe even meaning. He gave them only motion, gestures, orders spoken in a low, steady voice. They obeyed not out of faith, but because movement itself had become a form of survival. He had long since stopped pretending that orders came from belief. They came from habit. The only thing that still mattered was time. Each hour stolen from defeat was an hour that someone, somewhere else, could use to escape. The afternoon passed in restless quiet. The men scavenged the battlefield for ammunition, stripping weapons from frozen corpses, searching the wrecks of burned trucks. The commander walked among them, calm but alert. Every sound, every echo of wind through the trees felt like an omen. He could sense the return of the enemy before he saw it. And when the first artillery shells landed again, he was already moving. The bombardment lasted longer this time. The ground trembled, snow and dirt raining down from shattered branches. The commander stayed low, counting the seconds between impacts, gauging the pattern. They were adjusting their aim, closing in. When the shelling finally stopped, the world went unnaturally quiet. That silence, he had learned, was the most dangerous part. It was the breath the world took before the next scream. Then they came. Hundreds of dark figures spilling across the field, their silhouettes blurred by smoke and snow. The commander shouted for his men to open fire. Rifles cracked in uneven rhythm. Machine guns chattered until their barrels steamed. The Soviets advanced relentlessly, stepping over their dead, firing back in flashes of orange light. The forest echoed with the sound of war reborn. Minutes turned to hours. The line wavered, bent, then held again. The commander moved like a shadow through the chaos, shouting, firing, dragging wounded men back into cover. He fought not like a strategist, but like a survivor, each action instinctive, stripped of thought. Bullets tore the air around him, splintering trees, punching into the earth. At one point, a shell landed so close that it threw him to the ground. When he rose, ears ringing, the world seemed distant. The noise muffled, his vision narrowed to fragments. Flashes of movement, snow, blood, smoke. The relief force brought more noise than comfort. Engines growled through the gray dawn, tracks grinding the frozen earth as supply trucks and armored vehicles rolled into what was left of the line. The smell of diesel and smoke replaced that of burned wood and blood. Fresh soldiers disembarked, young, clean, wide-eyed, staring in quiet disbelief at the sight before them. The trenches were little more than uneven scars in the earth, half filled with snow and corpses. The survivors of the last stand were unrecognizable from the newcomers. Faces sunken, eyes hollow, movements slow and deliberate, like men whose bodies had forgotten how to be alive. The commander stood apart, his greatcoat stiff with frost, his cap pulled low against the cold wind. He watched as medics moved through the wounded, pulling the living from among the frozen. Each man they saved looked the same, blank, pale, expressionless. The human face, he thought, had only so many ways to hold exhaustion. A staff officer approached, clipboard in hand, crisp in his uniform despite the mud. He introduced himself with a salute, but the commander barely acknowledged it. The officer began speaking. Casualty numbers, supply status, reassignment details, all in the precise, detached tone of someone discussing figures, not lives. The commander listened only long enough to understand that he and his men were being pulled back from the front. Temporary relief, they called it. Reorganization. In truth, it was the Army's way of extracting whatever fragments of usefulness remained before the inevitable end. When the officer finished, the commander simply nodded. He gave no report, no reflection. There was nothing to say that a piece of paper could hold. The man in front of him would never understand what had happened here, not really. He could only count it. By midday, the bodies were being loaded into trucks. The commander's men, what few were left, helped without being told. They worked in silence, their movements mechanical. Each time they lifted a corpse, the snow beneath revealed frozen pools of black blood that glistened like oil in the dim light. The sky above was low and gray, pressing down as if trying to bury the scene itself. When the trucks departed, the field looked strangely empty, as though the violence had been erased. Only the scars remained, the shell holes, the twisted trees, the fragments of helmets and rifles half buried in the snow. The commander walked through it slowly, tracing the line where the trench had been. He found a patch of earth still marked by footprints. His, perhaps, or someone else's, half frozen into the mud. The imprint of survival, fragile and meaningless, soon to vanish under the next snowfall. The retreat westward began that evening. The commander led the remnants of his unit along a road lined with burned-out vehicles and shattered wagons. The landscape looked endless, a gray expanse of ruins and drifting snow. Every few kilometers, they passed groups of refugees, civilians trudging through the cold, dragging carts, carrying children wrapped in blankets. None of them spoke to the soldiers. There was no difference between them anymore, except the direction they walked. By the time night fell, the column had stopped in what was left of a railway station. Half the roof was gone, the rest covered in soot and frost. The men collapsed wherever they could, leaning against walls, curling up beneath broken benches. The commander remained outside, staring at the dark horizon. Far away, artillery flashes pulsed like distant lightning. The sound followed seconds later, low, rhythmic, almost soothing in its consistency. He thought again of the ridge, of the village, of all the places he had held and lost. They blurred together now. One long, unbroken battle stretched across frozen miles. He tried to remember the names of the dead, but they were slipping away, replaced by faces he could no longer place. War had a way of erasing even the act of remembrance. At some point, a junior officer approached him with a steaming mug of black coffee. The commander accepted it without a word. The liquid was bitter and burned his tongue, but the heat reminded him that he still existed. The young officer hesitated, then asked quietly if the commander thought they would ever stop retreating. For a long time, there was no reply. Then finally, the commander said, "Everything stops eventually." His voice was calm, but it carried no comfort. When dawn came, the wind rose again. Snow swept across the station, erasing tracks and footprints, smoothing out the chaos into something almost beautiful. The men stirred, shouldering their rifles, preparing to march again. The commander lingered a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the east. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the Soviets were advancing, step by step, filling the void his defense had bought them time to create. The days that followed blurred into one long march through desolation. The retreat westward was endless, a slow procession of hollow men, vehicles coughing black smoke, and horses staggering under impossible loads. Snow fell without pause, sometimes thick and heavy, sometimes drifting like ash, settling on helmets, rifles, and faces that no longer felt the cold. The war was everywhere now, not in battles or explosions, but in silence, in the numb rhythm of boots sinking into snow. The commander walked at the head of what remained of his unit, though the word unit no longer meant anything. They were survivors stitched together by exhaustion. Some were new recruits absorbed from shattered divisions, others were ghosts from old campaigns, men who had fought too long to remember why. They followed him not out of duty, but because he moved forward, and moving forward was all there was left to do. At night, they camped in abandoned barns or along roadsides, building small fires that barely burned against the wind. The commander sat apart, keeping watch even when there was nothing to watch for. Sleep was a luxury he no longer trusted. Every time his eyes closed, the ridge returned. The snow, the flashes, the faces of the men he'd left buried beneath it. The past came back in fragments, replaying without sound, a film running forever on a broken reel. One evening, as they passed through a village half buried in snow, they came across a church that had survived the shelling. The roof was gone, the walls blackened by fire, but the bell tower still stood, leaning slightly. The commander stopped and looked at it for a long time. The men behind him slowed, uncertain whether to keep moving. The tower seemed out of place, a relic of a world that no longer existed, a monument to something that had been forgotten. He entered the church alone. Inside, the floor was covered with shattered glass and snow that had drifted through the open roof. A single iron cross hung crooked above what had once been the altar. In front of it lay a pile of burned hymn books, their pages fused together. The air smelled faintly of smoke and dust. He walked to the front and knelt, not in prayer but in stillness. For the first time in months, he allowed the weight of everything to settle. The men he'd lost, the orders that had turned survival into arithmetic, the quiet horror of realizing that none of it would ever matter. He stayed there until the wind howled through the empty rafters, then rose and left without looking back. The men waiting outside didn't ask what he'd done inside. Some crossed themselves, others just stared. They resumed their march, their boots crunching softly over the snow. The church bell, cracked and rusted, swayed faintly in the wind, letting out a low, mournful sound that followed them for miles. The further west they went, the more the landscape changed. Villages grew smaller, the forest thinner, the ground darker with thawing mud. They passed streams choked with ice, bridges shattered by retreating engineers, fields littered with burned tanks and frozen horses. The commander noticed the faces of civilians they encountered, wary, hollow, eyes watching from behind curtains or fences. No one spoke to the soldiers. No one offered food or shelter. The war had taught everyone the same language: silence. By the time they reached the next staging point, half the unit was gone. Stragglers lost to frostbite, disease, or despair. The commander didn't record their names. There was no paper left for that, and no point. Command would never ask for those names, only for numbers. The living became statistics, and the dead became snow. One night, while the men slept in a derelict rail yard, he stood alone among the tracks. The sky was clear for once, stars glinting like shards of ice. He could hear the distant rumble of artillery to the east, steady and inevitable. The sound had become the pulse of the world. He closed his eyes and listened to it, not with fear or anticipation, but with recognition. It was the sound of something larger than all of them, the slow machinery of history grinding forward. He realized then that his survival was an accident, not a reward. Every suicidal plan he'd made, every impossible stand, had not been courage, only momentum. He had kept moving because stopping would have meant admitting what the war had already decided, that there was no meaning left to be found. When dawn broke, he turned his back to the east and kept walking. The men followed without question, their shadows long on the frozen ground. The wind picked up again, sweeping across the plain, erasing their footprints as they went. Behind them, the sky flickered with the faint glow of distant fires, and the sound of artillery rolled endlessly across the horizon. A reminder that somewhere out there, another commander was being told the same thing. Hold the line, just for a little longer. The thaw came late that year. When it finally did, it brought not relief, but ruin. The snow melted into mud, swallowing boots, clogging engines, and dragging down everything that tried to move through it. Rivers overflowed, bridges collapsed, and the retreat turned into chaos. Columns splintered across the countryside, the roads choked with refugees and broken machines. The front was no longer a line. It was a slow-motion collapse, an army dissolving into the land it once tried to hold. The commander's unit, now barely 20 men, trudged through the wreckage of spring. Their coats were soaked, their faces streaked with mud. The thaw exposed everything the snow had hidden. Corpses half buried in ditches, helmets glinting in puddles, the twisted remains of vehicles that looked almost alive in the mist. The air smelled of decay and wet metal. Each step forward was another reminder that they were walking through the grave of an army that no longer existed. The commander led them west, following half-flooded roads that ran between fields of mud and shallow lakes. Sometimes they passed other groups of soldiers, ragged, hungry, lost, who stared at them with the same numb disbelief. There was no sense of rank anymore, no discipline. The war had stripped them all down to the same blank state, bodies moving through time, driven by orders that had stopped making sense months ago. They reached a small town near dusk. What was left of it? The roofs were gone, the streets filled with wreckage and water. Smoke drifted from the chimneys of a few surviving houses, though the windows were dark. The commander ordered the men to take shelter in a barn at the edge of town. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay, rot, and damp wood. They lit no fire. Smoke would draw attention. They ate what little they had, the silence between them heavier than the hunger. That night, rain began again, drumming on the tin roof, steady and relentless. The commander sat near the doorway, staring out into the downpour. The sound of rain blurred everything. The whispers of his men, the distant thunder of artillery, the world itself. His mind drifted between moments, memories blurring into one another. The ridge, the burning village, the forest, the endless marches. He wondered if he had ever truly left any of those places, or if he was still there in some other version of himself, fighting the same unwinnable battle over and over again. Sometime before dawn, he heard the faint rumble of engines. Not near, but close enough to stir instinct. He rose and stepped outside, the rain soaking through his uniform in seconds. The horizon flickered with light, not lightning, but the dull orange glow of something burning. The Soviets were advancing again. He felt no fear, only inevitability. The war was a tide, and he was a stone caught in its current. At sunrise, he gathered his men. Their faces were gaunt and pale, eyes hollowed by fatigue. They looked at him the way dying men look at a priest, not for hope, but for confirmation that there was none left. He gave them simple orders: move west, stay in the woods, avoid contact. There was no point in holding another line. There were no lines left to hold. The war was already behind them, closing like a shadow. As they marched out of the town, they passed a group of civilians, farmers mostly, women and children, dragging carts piled with their lives. One of them, an old woman, stopped and stared at the commander. Her eyes were sharp and tired, filled with something that wasn't hatred, but something older, deeper, understanding. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and he returned the gesture. Then she turned away, leading her people east, back toward the fires. The commander and his men crossed a bridge barely standing, the river beneath swollen and violent. Halfway across, he stopped and looked back. The town was already fading into the mist, its ruins indistinguishable from the landscape. It struck him then how the war erased not just lives, but places, how each battle left behind a kind of blankness that could never be filled. They moved on through fields where the grass was beginning to return, green pushing through the mud. Spring had come, but it felt wrong, too alive, too bright against the gray remnants of winter. The commander felt a strange dissonance watching it. Life was returning to a world that hadn't yet finished dying. That night they camped near a river bend, hiding under a grove of birch trees. The moonlight flickered through the branches, glinting off the water. The men slept quickly, too tired for dreams. The commander stayed awake, listening to the river. Its current was strong, unbothered by the war that had torn everything else apart. He envied it, the simplicity of motion, the lack of memory. Weeks passed, and the march became a kind of exile. The commander and his men moved through landscapes that no longer looked like battlefields but carried the same quiet ruin. Fields churned to mud, forests stripped bare, villages reduced to charcoal and ash. The war was receding behind them, but its echo was everywhere. Every burned house, every rusted helmet half buried in dirt reminded them that retreat wasn't escape. It was just survival stretched thin. Food grew scarce. They foraged, scavenged, traded what little they had for bread or potatoes when they met farmers too weary to care which army they belonged to. Some nights they slept in barns, others in ditches or under broken wagons. The men had stopped counting the days. The commander still carried his map, though the lines on it had lost their meaning. Roads had vanished, towns no longer existed. Every direction led deeper into ruin. Once they crossed a valley where spring had fully taken hold. The grass was high, the air smelled faintly of thawed earth and smoke. Birds moved through the trees, cautious and few. It should have been beautiful, but the silence was too pure, too absolute. The commander paused on the ridge, looking across the valley, and realized he could no longer tell where one battle had ended and another had begun. The war had blended everything together: land, memory, time. It was all one long, frozen day. One afternoon, they reached a rail line stretching west. The tracks were bent and rusted, the sleepers warped by fire. A train lay derailed in the distance, its cars overturned and scattered. The men approached cautiously, weapons ready, but there was no sound, no movement. Inside the wrecked cars, they found only emptiness. Crates split open, straw frozen in place, a few scattered personal items, a child's shoe, a broken watch, a torn letter written in a language none of them recognized. The commander stood in the doorway of one of the cars for a long time, staring at the items as if they could explain something. But they explained nothing. They were simply what was left when the world stopped making sense. That night, the men built a small fire beside the tracks. The light flickered on their faces, carving deep lines in the hollows of their cheeks. No one spoke. The commander sat slightly apart, watching the smoke drift upward into the stars. He thought of all the positions he'd been ordered to hold. The ridge, the forest, the river. Each one a fragment of a map that meant nothing now. He had obeyed every command, survived every suicidal plan, and yet the outcome had never changed. The line always broke. The line always moved. The line always came back. He wondered what his men saw when they looked at him. To them, perhaps, he was a figure of certainty, the one who always found a way to hold the impossible. But he knew the truth, that every victory had been nothing more than a delay, a pause in the inevitable. He was not a commander anymore. He was a keeper of time, a man who measured meaning in hours stolen from collapse. Sometime after midnight, one of the men died in his sleep. No wounds, no sound. He simply stopped breathing. The others buried him at dawn beside the tracks, marking the grave with a piece of wood scavenged from the wreck. The commander didn't speak a eulogy. There were no words left for the dead. He simply pressed a handful of soil over the mound and stood there as the wind swept across the field, bending the tall grass in long, soft waves. They moved on, fewer now. The countryside began to change, hills rising gently, the soil darker, the air warmer. They were getting closer to the heart of Germany, to the end of the retreat. But the closer they came, the heavier the silence grew. The villages they passed were not destroyed by shell fire, but by abandonment. Doors swung open in the wind. Fields lay untended. The war had hollowed everything out, leaving behind the shape of a country that no longer believed in itself. One evening, as they camped in an orchard, the commander saw smoke on the horizon. Thin, straight columns, too controlled to be random. He knew immediately what it meant. Controlled burns, destruction of supplies, the final act of a collapsing army trying to deny the enemy what it could no longer defend. The end was approaching, and even the landscape was beginning to surrender. The men asked him what would happen when they reached the west. Would they find another line to hold? Would there be orders waiting or surrender? The commander didn't answer. He didn't know. He only knew that the war had reached a point where the difference between holding and falling no longer existed. By the time they reached the western hills, the war was dying. The sound of artillery had faded into the distance, replaced by an unfamiliar silence that carried no rhythm of battle, no pulse of urgency. The roads were littered with wreckage and refugees, streams of soldiers and civilians flowing westward. The last movement of a collapsing army that no longer believed in orders. The men in gray walked among the ruins like ghosts returning to their own graves. The commander led what was left of his unit, 8 men, some limping, one half blind, all too tired to speak. Their boots were worn through, their coats shredded by wind and mud. The insignia on their uniforms had faded to anonymity. They no longer looked like soldiers, and perhaps they weren't anymore. The war had burned away the distinction between fighter and survivor. They arrived at a small ridge overlooking a valley. Below them, smoke curled from a distant town, not from shelling this time, but from burning fields, a deliberate act of retreat. Beyond that lay a river glinting under pale sunlight, and past it, the last line of German defenses that had not yet fallen. The commander stopped there, staring down at the landscape, his expression unreadable. He knew this sight. It was the same as every other line he had been ordered to hold, only quieter, smaller, already hollow. The men stood behind him, waiting. They expected orders. Dig in, prepare, survive another 48 hours. It was what he had always told them. But he said nothing. His eyes traced the valley, the smoke, the fields that would soon be nothing but memory. He had seen too many of these places vanish, consumed by fire, buried by snow, forgotten by maps. Each one had demanded everything and given nothing back. He sat down on a rock, the weight of his rifle resting across his knees. The men lowered their packs and followed suit, forming a loose circle around him. For the first time, they did not build defenses, did not scout the terrain. They simply sat, breathing the cold air, listening to the wind. It carried the faintest scent of spring. Earth thawing, grass returning. It was almost peaceful. Hours passed. The sun began to sink behind the hills, painting the valley in dull gold. From somewhere far off, they heard the rumble of engines. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to remind them that the war still existed beyond the horizon. The commander watched the light fade until the landscape turned silver. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "This is far enough." No one answered. There was nothing to question. They all understood. The line he had been holding for years, the invisible boundary between duty and futility, had finally reached its end. There were no more orders to obey, no more hours to buy with blood. The silence around them was the only command left. That night, they made a small fire, their last. The flames flickered weakly, their smoke rising straight into the still air. The men passed around a single loaf of bread and a flask of water. They ate slowly, without speaking. When the fire burned low, they lay down in the grass, rifles beside them, the stars cold and distant above. The commander stayed awake, watching the embers fade. His thoughts wandered, not to victory or loss, but to the faces of the men he had lost, the empty towns, the snow-covered ridge where everything had begun. He realized then that the line he had held had never been about territory. It had been about time. The illusion that holding one more day could somehow hold back the inevitable. For years, he had fought not for Germany, not for command, but for the belief that endurance itself could give meaning to chaos. But now even that illusion had melted away. The world no longer needed him to hold anything. As dawn broke, the wind shifted, carrying the faint toll of church bells from the valley below. The sound of a town waking, of a war finally loosening its grip. The commander stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. The others rose behind him, waiting. He looked east, where the morning light touched the ruined fields, and then west, toward the hills where the sky was already warming with the promise of something else. Not peace, but an ending. He gave no final speech, no farewell. He simply turned toward the river and began walking. The men followed, silent as the snow that once buried them. When they reached the valley floor, the sunlight caught their silhouettes, worn, bent, but still moving. To anyone watching from a distance, they might have looked like ghosts crossing into the light. And perhaps they were. The last remnants of a war that refused to die cleanly, the final echoes of a commander who had spent years holding lines that the world no longer remembered. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.